That line used to make me uncomfortable because for a long time, freedom wasn't something I associated with belief. Freedom was dangerous. Freedom meant you could choose wrong. And the safest way to avoid choosing wrong, I thought, was to let someone or something bigger than me make the choices for me. Belief gave me certainty, or at least I thought it did. I had a framework where every important question had an official answer. Who I was, why I was here, what I should value, how I should live. It was all mapped out, neatly, completely, unquestioningly. And it felt like safety, but there's a quiet cost to that kind of safety. You stop asking questions that don't fit the map. You stop thinking about roads that aren't already drawn. You learn to redirect curiosity into approved paths. And the more you do that, the more the map becomes your world. I didn't lose my belief all at once. It was a slow, uncomfortable unraveling. Little cracks at first, questions that didn't have satisfying answers. Then moments when the answers I got contradicted each other. And worst of all, the realization that I wasn't allowed to decide for myself which answers made sense. At first, I thought this was just part of the struggle. That doubt was something to wrestle with inside the system until I came back stronger. But the more I tried to wrestle, the more I realized the rules were fixed against me. You can question as long as you end up with the same conclusion you started with. You can doubt, as long as you call it a test of faith, not a search for truth. And slowly, I started to see the difference between freedom inside a fenced garden and freedom beyond the fence entirely. When I stepped beyond the fence, the first thing I noticed wasn't joy. It was fear, because for the first time, I couldn't point to a book, a tradition, or an authority and say, "That's why I believe this." I had to own. The first freedoms I noticed was the freedom to admit I don't know. In the world I came from, I don't know was never a complete answer. It had to be followed by, "But God does." That second part was meant to comfort, but in reality, it shut the door. It turned every unknown into a solved mystery, whether or not it was actually solved. When I stopped needing to plug God into every gap, I started to see those gaps differently, not as failures to be covered up, but as opportunities to learn. It's strange. The same unanswered question that once made me uneasy started to feel exciting, because now the answer could actually change as I learned more. That's another freedom people don't talk about much, the freedom for your beliefs to evolve. In a rigid system, changing your mind can be seen as weakness or betrayal. Outside it, changing your mind is just growth. Then there was the freedom in morality. When your moral code is handed to you as a fixed list, it can feel reassuring. You never have to ask the hard questions. But you also never get to ask the hard questions. I began to see that morality wasn't a checklist from the past. It was a living process. It could respond to new knowledge, to new understanding of harm and well-being. For example, in my old framework, right and wrong were sometimes defined by authority alone. An action was wrong because it was forbidden, not because it caused harm. Stepping out of that, I had to confront morality directly. That meant weighing consequences, empathy, fairness, not just obedience. It was harder, but it was also more honest. Because if I treated someone well, it was because I chose to, not because I feared punishment or wanted a reward. There was also a quieter, more personal freedom, the freedom to stop pretending. When you live in a belief system you no longer fully believe in, you start to perform. You say the right words, you nod at the right moments, you laugh at the right lines in the sermon. Not because you agree, but because it's safer. Leaving meant I could be the same person in every room. I didn't have to filter my thoughts to match the group around me. That might sound small, but it's exhausting to constantly edit yourself. Losing that weight felt like breathing more deeply than I had in years. I also started to notice changes in my relationships. Some became harder. There's no point pretending otherwise. Leaving a shared belief can create distance with people who still hold it. But other relationships became more real, without the framework telling me who was in or out. I started connecting with people for who they were, not for whether they ticked the right theological boxes. And here's something I didn't expect. I started listening better. Because I no longer had the pressure to fit every conversation into a predetermined conclusion. I could just hear people without needing to win them over. One of the most immediate changes I felt was the quieting of background fear. Not the big, dramatic fear of death or hell, although those took time to fade, but the smaller, constant fear of slipping up in ways I didn't even understand. In a closed belief system, the rules aren't just about what you do. They can extend to what you think, feel, or even fail to feel. You're told to love a certain way, to think a certain way, to want a certain way. And when you don't, you start carrying a low-grade anxiety that you're somehow always wrong. Psychologists call this chronic self-monitoring, a mental habit where you're constantly checking yourself against an external standard. It's exhausting, and it eats away at your sense of autonomy. When I stepped outside that system, the silence was strange at first. There was no invisible checklist running in my head. No need to apologize for thoughts I couldn't control. The absence of that mental noise was, in itself, a form of freedom. Then there was guilt. Not the useful kind of guilt, the kind that comes when you hurt someone and want to make it right, but the inherited, automatic guilt for simply being human. That guilt thrives in systems that teach you you're broken by default. It ensures loyalty, because if you start with a debt you can't repay, you'll always need the institution that offers forgiveness. When that premise fell away, the guilt I was left with was specific. If I messed up, it was because of a choice I made, not because I was born defective. That shift doesn't just lighten the load. It changes how you act. You take responsibility because you own your actions, not because you're trying to erase a cosmic stain. Fear also changes form. Before, some fears were off limits to challenge. Eternal punishment, divine judgment, supernatural warfare. Even when I doubted them, I didn't feel safe to fully let them go. There's a concept in cognitive science called sticky belief, ideas that stay in your mind because the cost of being wrong feels too high. When I finally allowed myself to treat those fears like any other claim, they lost their grip. It wasn't instant. You can't just flip a switch, but each time I tested the fear and nothing happened, the hold got weaker. The freedom here isn't about becoming fearless. It's about knowing your fears are tied to reality, not to inherited stories you're not allowed to question. Even my sense of identity began to feel freer. Before, I had a label that told me not just what I believed, but who I was allowed to be. Outside that label, I could explore without the fear that every choice had eternal weight. I could try, fail, adjust, and try again without wondering if I'd crossed some invisible, irreversible line. That kind of freedom is subtle, but it's the difference between walking a tightrope and walking on open ground. Intellectual freedom sounds abstract until you've lived without it. In a belief system with fixed answers, your thinking always has boundaries, even if you don't notice them. The boundaries aren't just "don't question this idea." They're also "don't even frame the question in a way that could threaten the answer." Inside that space, curiosity can be encouraged, but only in directions that don't risk overturning the foundation. You can dig deep into certain topics, but you have to step carefully around others. When I stepped outside that space, it was like a lens being swapped. Suddenly, the untouchable topics were just topics. I could pick up any question about the origins of life, morality, consciousness, the universe, and follow it wherever the evidence led. There was no point where I had to stop and say, "This is as far as I can go," because the conclusion might be wrong. One of the most liberating parts of that was how it changed my relationship with evidence. Before, evidence could be welcomed or dismissed depending on whether it supported the conclusion I was supposed to reach. Now, I didn't have to defend an answer. I could let the answer change based on the evidence. That sounds simple, but it's not how we usually live under rigid belief systems. If you start with the conclusion and work backward, you're not doing reasoning. You're doing rationalization. Intellectual freedom means reversing that, starting with observation and letting it lead to conclusion, even if the conclusion is uncomfortable. Another change was in how I dealt with uncertainty. When you've been told your whole life that the goal is absolute certainty, uncertainty feels like failure. But the truth is, uncertainty is built into reality. There will always be questions we can't fully answer. Outside the system, I learned to treat uncertainty not as a void to fear, but as part of the process. That doesn't mean drifting aimlessly. It means building the best understanding you can with the information you have and updating it when you learn more. There's a kind of humility in that. Not the enforced humility of calling yourself unworthy, but the natural humility of knowing you're a human with limits. And paradoxically, that humility makes you stronger in the long run because you're not fragile in the face of new information. Intellectual freedom also changes everyday decision-making. When your choices aren't filtered through, "What does this authority say?" you can evaluate them based on actual consequences. That means considering how an action will affect you, others, and the world, rather than how it fits a pre-written moral rule. In practical terms, it makes you more flexible. You can adapt when circumstances change, instead of feeling trapped by rules that don't fit the situation. And that adaptability isn't moral weakness. It's moral responsiveness. This kind of thinking also makes conversation richer. In the past, if I disagreed with someone, I'd be tempted to prove them wrong using my beliefs framework, which only worked if they shared the framework. Now, I can meet people on common ground, logic, evidence, shared values. And that creates space for genuine exchange rather than scripted debate. And the more I exercised that freedom, the more I realized how rare it actually is. How many people still edit their thinking before it even reaches their lips because they know certain conclusions. One of the things I didn't expect when I left belief was how much my emotional landscape would change. Not just what I felt, but how I experienced and processed emotions. Inside a rigid belief system, emotions aren't just emotions. They're often judged, labeled, and sorted into acceptable and unacceptable categories based on doctrine. Love is encouraged, but only for the right people. Anger is condemned, unless it's righteous anger against the approved targets. Joy is celebrated, but grief has to be framed in a way that fits the story. The result is that you're not just feeling. You're constantly running a silent commentary on whether your feelings are the right kind. That creates something psychologists call emotional dissonance. It's when there's a gap between what you actually feel and what you believe you're supposed to feel. And over time, that gap can wear you down. When I stepped outside the belief system, that commentary started to fade. At first, it was disorienting, like walking without a handrail after years of relying on one. But slowly, I learned to experience emotions without rushing to judge them. Take grief, for example. In my old worldview, grief had to be paired with certain beliefs about an afterlife to be considered healthy. You could miss someone, but you also had to smile through it, reassure yourself and others they were in a better place. Outside of that framework, grief became both harder and more real. Harder because I could no longer soften it with stories I didn't actually believe, but more real because I could allow myself to feel the full weight of loss without editing it. And strangely, that honesty made it easier to connect with others. I could comfort people without feeling the need to offer explanations neither of us truly knew. Love changed, too. Before, love often came with boundaries. Who it was okay to love, and how. There were entire categories of people I was encouraged to keep at arm's length. And even the people I could love were sometimes seen through the lens of helping them believe what I believed. When those boundaries fell away, my relationships deepened in ways I hadn't expected. Love stopped being a strategic act, something aimed at moving people toward a spiritual goal, and became an end in itself. I could care for someone without needing them to change, and that made the connection more genuine. Even anger felt different. In the belief system, anger was often a problem unless it was aimed at the right things, injustices defined by doctrine. If I felt anger about something outside those boundaries, I'd be told to pray it away or reframe it. Outside, I realized anger can be healthy when it points to a real injustice. It can be a signal that something's wrong and needs to be addressed. The difference was, I no longer had to run my anger through a theological filter before deciding whether it was legitimate. There's also relief in letting go of fear-driven emotions. Many belief systems rely on what psychologists call aversive control, guiding behavior through fear of punishment or loss. The fear might be about eternal consequences, or about being cast out socially, or about disappointing a divine figure. When that layer fell away, fear didn't disappear from my life, but it became grounded in reality. I could focus on real risks and challenges, not imagined supernatural ones. And that shift made me calmer overall, because I wasn't living in a constant state of invisible threat. Even joy became richer. Before, joy was often tied to feeling blessed, as if every good thing had to be a gift from a higher power. That sounds nice, but it also took away my own role in creating joy. Now, when I feel joy, I can credit the real causes, the effort I put into something, the kindness of others, the luck of timing. And that makes it feel more solid, because it's not tied to the favor of something that could vanish if I fell out of step. Perhaps the biggest emotional freedom, though, was self-acceptance. Without a doctrine constantly telling me I was flawed by nature, I could see myself as a work in progress, not a problem to be fixed. I could hold both my strengths and my weaknesses without framing either in moral absolutes. That made it easier to extend the same acceptance to others. And that's when I realized emotional freedom isn't about feeling good all the time. It's about being able to feel honestly, to experience emotions as they are, without bending them to fit someone else's rules. If you want, I can now move to part 6, where I'll go just as deep into social freedom, breaking down how leaving belief changes community, belonging, social expectations, and the ability to form connections outside of rigid in-groups, with enough nuance to last another 10 minutes of narration. Social freedom is one of those changes you don't fully notice until you've lived without it for a while. Because when you grow up inside a closed belief system, your social world is shaped by it in ways you might not even see. It's not just who you spend time with. It's the unspoken rules about who counts as us and who's them. Who you should trust, who you should pity, who you should avoid. And the rules aren't just about people. They're about conversations, activities, even what kind of humor is acceptable. The belief system becomes a kind of social map. And as long as you stay on that map, you're surrounded by familiar faces, shared language, and predictable interactions. But step off it, and you risk losing that entire structure in one move. That's why leaving belief often comes with a kind of social shock. For me, some relationships cooled instantly. Not always out of anger, but out of discomfort. People didn't know how to relate to me without that shared framework. It hurt, but in the long run, it forced me to rethink what community actually meant. I'd been taught that real community could only exist inside the belief. But I began to see that real community has less to do with shared dogma and more to do with shared humanity. Without the filter of in-group and out-group, I found myself connecting with people I'd once ignored. People whose lives, beliefs, and backgrounds were completely different from mine. And yet, in many ways, we connected more deeply than I had with people I was supposed to feel close to. That's the irony. When you only form community inside a narrow circle, you miss the richness of the wider world. There's also a subtle kind of social freedom that comes from not having to represent a belief at all times. When you're part of a faith community, especially one that sees itself as the truth, you're not just yourself. You're a walking representative of the system. People judge your belief by your behavior, so you feel the pressure to be on all the time. Once that was gone, I could have conversations without the burden of representing anything larger than myself. I could laugh at jokes I actually found funny, admit when I didn't know something, or disagree openly without worrying about how it reflected on an entire religion. Another form of social freedom was the end of scripted relationships. In the past, friendships often came with an underlying mission to guide someone toward the belief or keep them from drifting away. That mission could make relationships feel less authentic because they were never entirely about the person in front of you. Without that, relationships could be what they were meant to be, connections for their own sake. No hidden agenda, no subtle pressure, just people being people. This doesn't mean it's all easy. Leaving can create real loneliness, especially in the early stages. You lose the built-in social network, the shared rituals, the sense of belonging. But here's what I discovered. When you rebuild your social world from scratch, it's smaller at first, but more solid. The people in it are there because of mutual respect and choice, not because a rulebook says you have to be connected, and that changes how you show up in those relationships. There's no fear that someone will vanish the moment you step outside the approved beliefs. That security, the kind built on acceptance rather than conformity, is its own kind of freedom. Social freedom, in the end, is the ability to form bonds that aren't policed by an ideology. To meet people as individuals, not as representatives of a category. To speak without rehearsing, to listen without filtering, and to belong without conditions. It's one of the most human freedoms there is, and it's one I didn't even know I was missing until I had it. Existential freedom is the hardest to explain because it's the most invisible when you're inside a belief system. It's not just about individual choices or relationships. It's about the framework that gives life its meaning. In a religious worldview, that framework is already built for you. You're told why you're here, where you're going, what matters, and what doesn't. Your role in the universe is written before you're born. And for a while, that can feel like an anchor, but an anchor can also be a weight. Because if you ever start to question that framework, you're not just doubting an idea. You're shaking the foundation of your entire life's purpose. When I left belief, the first feeling wasn't liberation. It was vertigo. The map I'd relied on for meaning was gone. Every why question that used to have a neat answer was suddenly open-ended. And with no eternal blueprint, I had to face the possibility that life had no predetermined purpose at all. That's the moment many people fear most, the so-called meaning crisis. And I get why. We're not used to holding that much uncertainty. But here's the thing. Once I sat with it long enough, I realized that not having a built-in purpose didn't make life meaningless. It made it mine. Without an eternal script, meaning stopped being something I discovered out there. It became something I created through relationships, through curiosity, through the work I choose to do and the way I choose to live. That kind of meaning isn't guaranteed, but it's real. It's woven into the everyday, in the kindness you show someone without expecting a reward, in the projects you pour yourself into, in the moments you're fully present. Mortality changed too. In the belief system, death came with a long epilogue. Heaven, hell, reincarnation, or some other continuation. Without that, death was just death. The end of consciousness, the final page. That's hard to face, but it also makes life sharper. Knowing this is the only chapter one get makes me pay more attention to it. Small things matter more, not because they're stepping stones to an afterlife, but because they're part of the only life I have. It also changes how I see other people's lives. If this is their one shot too, then their time matters as much as mine. That awareness makes empathy less conditional, more urgent. Existential freedom, at its core, is accepting that there's no cosmic safety net and deciding that's okay. It's realizing that meaning isn't handed down from above, but built from the ground up. That death isn't a failure of faith, but a natural part of being alive. It's not an easy freedom. It comes with responsibility, uncertainty, and the absence of guarantees. But it's also the most profound. Because when you can live fully without needing the universe to promise you a second chance, every moment becomes more precious. And that's when I understood what Sartre meant when he said, man is condemned to be free. It's a weight, yes, but it's also the greatest gift. The freedom to choose, to create, to shape a life that's yours, without waiting for permission from the sky. That's the freedom I found. And I wouldn't trade it for anything.